Well, it's as well to remember that when you're in discussion on some topic, you can easily lose your way by attending to things that really are not helpful. You might have someone say, well, it depends what you mean by so-and-so. And fair enough, a brief sort of, well, if you mean such and such, then so-and-so, and if you don't, you mean something else, then such and such, and so on. That can be helpful, but otherwise you can get bogged down in an argument with someone that something like, no, I think it means such and such, and then, no, it doesn't, it means so-and-so, as if it was some God-given entity that the definition of something is written in stone somewhere. What we mean by a word is what we mean by a word, and the people we're talking to will take it as meaning that, and that's important. So if, for instance, someone feels that I don't know, a cult is necessarily an evil thing, then things that are evil may well be cults, and things that are not evil are classified as not cults. So, for instance, if you were a member of the Catholic Church, you would not believe in your heart that you belong to a cult. But if I were a member of, for argument's sake, I don't know, Rosicrucians, then you might think that I do belong to a cult because you don't, and perhaps you see that particular structure as evil, and you would label it as a cult. And you might say, well, for instance, it has a dominant charismatic leader. I mean, I'm not sure as it has, but, supposing it does have, or has had in the past, some of the greats, perhaps, in fact, it's Jesus. I think it is actually for the Rosicrucians. They feel they have the genuine Christianity, I think, in some sense. So, on the other hand, it's clearly a belief system that's not the norm in the society that the greater society of the country say that you're living in. So it's a cult in that sense, perhaps. Perhaps it's one of those things which it's difficult to get out of, in the sense that you lose all your friendships and associations, and perhaps even associations with your family, if you no longer belong to the actual cult, so to speak. If you're no longer a Rosicrucian, perhaps your family have a lot less to do with you, and this would be a great cost to you and a great pressure to stay in, whether you believed in some of the finer theology of it or not. Well, quite simply, we can argue over definitions till the cows come home, and we can compare one dictionary's definition with another, and who's to say they're right? I mean, it's like using a lexicon to interpret some original documents, say, of Christianity, of early Christian writings or early writings, perhaps scripture, perhaps apocryphal, or just perhaps writings. It relies on whoever wrote the lexicon, that he got it right, they got it right. And, well, they're the great authorities. Yes, but people that translated the King James Bible, for instance, were the great authorities in their day, but were they necessarily right in hindsight? Not on some issues. They had theological axes to grind to distinguish themselves from what they felt were the evils of Catholicism and so forth. Don't let people hijack conversations and discussions of getting somewhere by these byroads. Be quick to agree with someone who has a rather bizarre definition of a word from your point of view, but in his context, yes, I see what you mean, but of course I don't actually have that definition, if you like, of that particular term. I mean, the word cult has been used probably so much in our media that even if it had a good possibility, it wouldn't have in the eyes of the public now, and it's an emotive word, in other words. If you can be identified as a cult member, well, you're condemned before you go any further by the sort of mainstream, or by those that feel that they're the mainstream. I mean, is it the case that if the cult takes over a nation and it's the national religion or view, it doesn't necessarily presumably have to be a religion, but we tend to think it is a religious type character, don't we? Or at least very strong value system that's deviant. But if it's no longer deviant and it takes over, does that make it therefore not a cult? Well, in the emotive sense, yes, because it's no longer a deviant. No, says Marshall. There's no one dimension that necessarily defines a particular entity, but an entity label may be used where a whole combination of certain extremes coincide. So we might say loosely, well, I think religious extremists, something to do with it in a cult, a charismatic leader, but of course many charismatic leaders doesn't make him running a cult. Yeah, but I mean, it is religious and he is an extremist, and it's very hard, for instance, to get out of it. In other words, you're not free. Once in, it's a one-way ticket. And it uses violence. Right, okay, so yeah. And you start to get the impression, well, I see how you wish to use the word. It's to cover a coincidence of these certain extremes and possibly other features. And you might not be actually strongly exhibiting any one of those extremes, but too many for comfort. And too many for comfort, we label it as a cult. And in some sense, rightly so, because it's of a category of entities that we find difficult to handle in society, and we want to draw attention to that, and we therefore label it accordingly. And sure, there is all sorts of arguments as to where's the boundary between what's a cult and what's just normal religion or normal belief practice, or not so normal because the society is pretty mixed anyway, so there isn't a normalcy to compare it to. But even so, you'd identify some things as cults because that's unusual and very troublesome and so forth, and does have a combination of at least some of these features that we can find are troublesome if they're together, more or less. In other words, we don't use language with technical precision and crystal clear definitions of clear boundaries. We might like language to be that way, but for everyday convenience and use, we don't. We speak in generalities. We might say, the French are very artistic. Is this particular Frenchman artistic? No, not particularly. But they tend to be. I've noticed it. And in a particular way too. They love such and such, And we're generalizing. But generalizations are incredibly useful to us. They're not to be dismissed. If in general driving much higher than the speed limit tends to be associated with accidents, it's as well to say driving fast is dangerous. Is it always dangerous? No, sometimes driving slow is dangerous if the passenger's going to die if I don't get her to hospital fast enough. There are going to be circumstances where, you see what I mean? But the generality is still right, isn't it? That, we don't want people driving at great speeds compared to the speed limit because it's likely to be pretty dangerous. And you don't win the argument by coming up with exceptions and saying, what do you mean by dangerous, for instance? I mean, well, what I thought most people mean, that, it could result in unhappiness, harm, injury, crashes. Why? What did you mean? I mean, beware of people that will turn a discussion into getting us nowhere and look very authoritative and deeply philosophical in so doing. You just tell them, hey, that's not a legitimate argument. Come on, be reasonable. Oh, depends what you mean by reasonable. I mean, you can find some people are not agreeable. Now, that alone is a major thing in discussion that you start to notice. This person's not agreeable, they're holding come what may and arguing every point. And you think he's not seeking, well, he might think he's seeking truth, but he's not actually seeking the generalities of living that are so important to us. And he's dismissing things that are, in fact, very important, albeit they generalities perhaps, but very important from the point of view of our welfare and our happiness. Really, I would say you are not going to arrive comfortably at truth in general if the person you're arguing with is arguing. If they're discussing and open to recognizing points that are right and points that they think are wrong too, then you start to get the assurance that you can make reasonable headway. But if everything you say is jumped on as wrong, and you can't find anything that they say that's right, you're not going to get anywhere with each other. But what's wrong is not your ability to reason. It's your lack of love and understanding and compassion for the other person. So I can be in mid-throw in discussion, you might even say argument, and someone says something, a complete contradiction to me, and I say, oh yes, well in that sense I agree with you. That's right, yes. Oh yes. And they look at you bewildered as, hang on, you're supposed to be contradicting what I do to win an argument, aren't you? But of course you're not out to win an argument. You're actually out to seek the truth. And if they say something in their discourse that's true, you jump in there and say, oh, well, yeah, yes, of course. Yes, I agree. Now, you may put a but in their face, of course, and that's probably not a good idea. At that time, just let it stay. Oh, yes, I agree with that. The very casual hearer may think, oh, you mean you're surrendering your argument to theirs? No, I agree with that point. It doesn't affect my argument. My main thrust is still valid, so and so. Say, oh, but I've known people who were, I don't know, rugby players that did not drink beer, I say, oh, well, yeah, of course, yes. Oh, yes, of course. It doesn't mean to say that I've still got the general picture that rugby players tend to drink beer, I agree, there are exceptions. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, of course. As opposed to trying to let the person force me into a corner where I'm saying all instead of most. Most as far as I can see. And, you can't sort of pin me down on, well, what experience, how many rugby players do you know personally? I don't know many that. Well, I don't think I do. Don't talk about rugby, I mean, most of New Zealand does, but How's that for a generalisation? But I know some New Zealanders that don't. I think I'll leave it there.